Throughout history, human societies have been structured around institutions that wield significant authority over individuals' lives. Governments enact laws and enforce order, while religious institutions provide moral guidance and spiritual solace. However, a critical examination reveals that the authority these institutions claim is often built on unchallenged beliefs rather than rational foundations. This article aims to deconstruct the perceived legitimacy of governmental and religious authorities, advocating for a society grounded in reason, evidence, and individual autonomy. The construct of authority. Authority, by definition, is the recognized right to command and enforce obedience. In both governmental and religious contexts, this authority is frequently justified through appeals to tradition, divine sanction, or social contract theories. However, these justifications often lack empirical support and rely heavily on societal conditioning. Image: a puppet master's hand controlling marionette strings attached to a crowd, symbolizing societal manipulation. The fallacy of divine right. Religious institutions often assert authority based on divine will, claiming that their doctrines are infallible and their leaders are chosen or inspired by a higher power. This appeal to divine authority is a classic example of the argument from authority fallacy, where a proposition is deemed true because an authority or tradition asserts it without substantive evidence. Such claims discourage critical inquiry and promote dogmatic adherence. Image: an empty throne with a crown hovering above it, representing the intangible nature of divine authority. Governmental authority and the social contract. The legitimacy of governmental authority is often defended through the social contract theory, which posits that individuals consent, either explicitly or implicitly, to surrender certain freedoms in exchange for security and order. However, this theory presupposes a unanimous agreement that rarely exists in reality. Many individuals are born into systems where consent is assumed, not given, raising ethical concerns about the validity of such authority. Image: a broken chain symbolizing the questioning of binding social contracts. The role of fear and control. Both religious and governmental institutions have historically employed fear as a mechanism of control. Religions may threaten spiritual punishment, while governments impose legal penalties. This use of fear suppresses individual autonomy and critical thinking, leading to a populace that complies out of apprehension rather than rational agreement. Image: a shadowy figure holding a whip over cowering individuals, illustrating control through fear. The ethical implications. Blind adherence to authority can lead to ethical dilemmas where individuals commit acts they might otherwise find objectionable, simply because an authority mandates it. This phenomenon was notably explored in the Milgram experiments, which demonstrated that people are willing to administer harmful actions to others when instructed by an authority figure. Image: a person standing at a crossroads, with one path leading to a government building and the other to a place of worship, highlighting ethical choices. The path to individual autonomy. To foster a society that values reason and evidence over unexamined authority, individuals must cultivate critical thinking skills and question the legitimacy of the powers that govern them. This involves scrutinizing the foundations of religious doctrines and governmental laws, seeking empirical evidence, and engaging in open discourse. Image: a person breaking free from chains, symbolizing liberation through critical thinking. Conclusion: the perceived authority of governments and religious institutions often rests on precarious foundations of tradition, fear, and unchallenged beliefs. By applying logic, reason, and evidence, individuals can dismantle these constructs, paving the way for a society that prioritizes autonomy, ethical integrity, and rational thought. Image: a light bulb illuminating a dark room, representing enlightenment through reason. References: Argument from Authority, n.wikipedia.org's wiki, Argument from Authority, The Age of Reason, n.wikipedia.org, The Age of Reason. Criticism of Democracy, n.wikipedia wiki, Criticism of Democracy. Atheism. Atheism, simply atheism. Critical Theory and the Problem of Authority, ht/link.springer.com/chapter/10.107/9783-030-34921-941. Note: The images described are for illustrative purposes and are not included in this text. Larken Rose and the Most Dangerous Superstition. Larken Rose is a libertarian thinker, author, and activist whose works challenge the conventional norms of governance, authority, and morality. At the heart of his philosophy is the idea that the belief in authority, the notion that some individuals or institutions have the moral right to rule over others, is a dangerous superstition that perpetuates widespread injustice and violence. This concept is explored in detail in his most well-known book, The Most Dangerous Superstition. The book serves as both a critique of institutionalized authority and a call for individuals to embrace personal responsibility, freedom, and non-aggression. The foundations of Larken Rose's philosophy. Larken Rose's arguments are rooted in a staunch commitment to individual liberty and a rejection of coercion in all its forms. He is associated with anarcho-capitalist and voluntarist schools of thought, which advocate for a society based on voluntary interactions rather than one governed by centralized authority. Rose argues that nearly all societal problems, wars, systemic oppression, economic exploitation, and even petty crime, can be traced back to the belief that some people have the legitimate right to forcibly control others. The central premise of the Most Dangerous Superstition is that the belief in authority is not only unnecessary, but also morally indefensible. To Rose, authority is a fiction, a collective hallucination that exists only because people believe in it. By questioning and dismantling this belief, Rose suggests humanity can move toward a more peaceful and cooperative world. Defining the most dangerous superstition. Rose defines the most dangerous superstition as the belief in authority. The idea that certain people or groups have the inherent right to command others, and that others have a moral obligation to obey. This belief underpins the legitimacy of governments, police forces, military institutions, and other forms of centralized power. Rose argues that authority is not a natural law or an immutable truth, but a social construct that requires constant indoctrination and enforcement to sustain. The illusion of legitimacy. One of Rose's key points is that authority is sustained not by physical force alone, but by psychological conditioning. From a young age, individuals are taught to equate obedience to authority with morality. This conditioning is reinforced through schools, religious institutions, media, and cultural norms. People are told that laws, even those they disagree with or find unjust, must be followed simply because they are decreed by legitimate authorities. Rose challenges this notion by arguing that morality cannot be outsourced to authority. For example, if it is wrong for an individual to steal or harm another person, it does not become morally acceptable simply because a government official or law permits it. By this logic, taxation, war, and other state-sanctioned activities that involve coercion or violence are inherently immoral. The moral paradox of authority. A recurring theme in the Most Dangerous Superstition is the moral paradox of authority. Rose points out that no individual has the moral right to rule over another. Yet when individuals come together to form governments or other institutions, they somehow claim a collective right to rule that no individual possessed in the first place. This, Rose contends, is a logical fallacy. Authority, therefore, is not a legitimate moral construct, but a pretense used to justify the use of force and coercion. The real-world consequences of belief in authority. Rose devotes much of his book to examining how the belief in authority leads to widespread harm. By convincing people that they have a moral duty to obey, authority enables atrocities on a massive scale. Wars, genocides, and systemic oppression are often carried out not by rogue individuals, but by ordinary people following orders. This phenomenon, sometimes referred to as the banality of evil, is facilitated by the belief that obedience to authority absolves individuals of personal responsibility. The role of government. Rose is particularly critical of governments, which he views as the primary institutionalization of authority. He argues that governments, regardless of their form, rely on coercion and violence to maintain control. Even democratic systems, which claim to derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, are, in Rose's view, fundamentally coercive. After all, individuals are compelled to obey laws and pay taxes under threat of punishment, regardless of whether they personally consent to these arrangements. Rose further critiques the idea that governments are necessary to maintain order, protect rights, or provide essential services. He argues that these functions can be fulfilled more effectively and ethically through voluntary cooperation and market mechanisms. For Rose, the key to a just society is not better governance, but the absence of governance altogether. Law enforcement and military institutions. Two of the most visible manifestations of authority are law enforcement and the military. Rose argues that these institutions are inherently immoral because they use violence and the threat of violence to enforce compliance. Police officers and soldiers, Rose contends, are not protectors of justice, but enforcers of the ruling class's will. By following orders, they often commit acts that would be considered criminal if performed by private individuals. For example, a police officer who arrests someone for a victimless crime, such as drug possession, is initiating force against an individual who has harmed no one. Similarly, a soldier who participates in an unjust war is complicit in acts of violence against innocent people. Rose argues that these actions are made possible only because the individuals involved believe they are acting under legitimate authority. Breaking free from the superstition. Rose's ultimate goal in the most dangerous superstition is to inspire individuals to reject the belief in authority and take responsibility for their own actions. He acknowledges that this is no easy task, as the belief in authority is deeply ingrained in most people. However, he maintains that it is possible and necessary for individuals to unlearn this belief and embrace a philosophy of voluntarism and non-aggression. Voluntarism and personal responsibility. Voluntarism, the belief that all human interactions should be voluntary and free from coercion, is central to Rose's vision of a free society. In a voluntarist society, individuals and groups would cooperate through mutual agreement rather than through the imposition of authority. Conflicts would be resolved through mediation and restitution rather than through punitive justice systems. Rose also emphasizes the importance of personal responsibility. Without the excuse of authority, individuals must take full accountability for their actions. This means refusing to participate in or support systems of coercion and violence, even when they are sanctioned by governments or other institutions. Education and advocacy. To dismantle the belief in authority, Rose advocates for education and open dialogue. He believes that by exposing the logical and moral flaws of authority, individuals can be persuaded to question their assumptions and adopt a more ethical worldview. Rose himself has dedicated much of his life to this cause through his writings, public speaking, and online content. Criticisms and controversies. While the most dangerous superstition has been praised by libertarians, anarchists, and other proponents of individual freedom, it has also faced criticism from various quarters. Some argue that Rose's vision of a stateless society is unrealistic, and that his critique of authority overlooks the practical benefits of governance. Others contend that his arguments rely too heavily on idealistic assumptions about human nature and voluntary cooperation. Critics also question whether a society without authority could effectively address issues such as crime, public health, and environmental protection. Rose responds to these criticisms by arguing that authority does not solve these problems, but often exacerbates them. He believes that solutions can be found through decentralized, voluntary systems, rather than centralized, coercive ones. Conclusion: a call to rethink authority. The most dangerous superstition is more than a critique of authority. It is a call to rethink the way we organize society and interact with one another. Larkin Rose challenges readers to question their assumptions about morality, governance, and personal responsibility. By exposing the belief in authority as a dangerous superstition, he invites individuals to envision a world based on freedom, cooperation, and mutual respect. For Rose, the path to a just society begins with a simple yet profound realization. No one has the right to rule over others, and no one is obligated to obey. This realization, he argues, has the power to transform not only individuals, but also the world as a whole. Whether one agrees with his conclusions or not, Rose's work serves as a provocative and thought-provoking exploration of some of the most fundamental questions about human society and morality. Certainly. Below is a detailed article about The End of All Evil by Jeremy Locke, which explores its key themes, concepts, and philosophical underpinnings. The End of All Evil, a revolutionary examination of freedom. Jeremy Locke's The End of All Evil is a thought-provoking, incendiary work that challenges the reader to fundamentally reconsider their understanding of freedom, control, and the structures that govern modern society. At its core, the book posits that all forms of evil stem from one source, the suppression of freedom. With unapologetic directness, Locke argues that societal constructs such as government, law, and culture perpetuate oppression under the guise of order and morality, urging humanity to reclaim its inherent sovereignty. A radical thesis, the nature of evil. Locke begins with a simple but bold assertion. Evil is anything that destroys or inhibits freedom. This definition serves as the foundation for his argument throughout the book. While many traditional views of evil focus on moral or religious interpretations, such as acts of violence or sin, Locke redefines evil as a systemic force that thrives on control. For him, any action, system, or ideology that limits an individual's freedom is inherently evil. This redefinition is revolutionary because it shifts the focus from individual wrongdoing to the larger societal frameworks that enable oppression. According to Locke, institutions that claim to protect people, such as governments, religious organizations, and cultural norms, are the primary culprits in the suppression of freedom. By presenting evil as an institutionalized force, Locke challenges the reader to question the very foundations of modern civilization. The role of governments and laws. Locke's critique of government is perhaps the most controversial aspect of his work. He argues that governments, regardless of their structure or intention, exist solely to control people. Even democratic systems, which claim to represent the will of the people, are inherently coercive because they impose laws and regulations that limit individual autonomy. Locke dismisses the notion that laws are necessary for order, it's asserting that they are tools of oppression disguised as safeguards. In his view, laws do not protect freedom. Instead, they erode it by punishing individuals for acting outside the boundaries of societal norms. This leads to a paradox where individuals are told they are free, yet their actions are constantly scrutinized and restricted by an external authority. For Locke, the concept of government contradicts the natural state of humanity, which is one of unrestrained liberty. He emphasizes that true freedom cannot coexist with any form of institutionalized power. While this perspective may seem extreme, Locke encourages the reader to consider the ways in which governments rely on fear and coercion to maintain control. The weaponization of culture. In addition to governments, Locke identifies culture as another major tool of oppression. He describes culture as the collective beliefs, values, and practices imposed on individuals by society. While culture is often seen as a unifying force, Locke views it as a mechanism for conformity and control. Locke argues that cultural norms are designed to suppress individuality and enforce compliance. From a young age, people are conditioned to accept certain beliefs and behaviors as normal or moral, often without questioning their validity. This conditioning creates a society in which individuals prioritize adherence to cultural expectations over their own freedom and happiness. One of Locke's most striking assertions is that culture perpetuates oppression by disguising it as virtue. For example, cultural ideals like patriotism or religious devotion are often used to justify obedience to authority. By framing submission as a moral obligation, culture ensures that individuals willingly participate in their own subjugation. The myth of security. Locke also challenges the idea that control is necessary for security. He argues that the promise of safety is one of the most effective tools used by institutions to justify the suppression of freedom. Governments, for example, claim that laws and enforcement are essential for protecting citizens from harm. However, Locke contends that this promise of security is an illusion designed to maintain power. According to Locke, true security comes not from external systems of control, but from individual empowerment. He asserts that people are capable of taking responsibility for their own lives and resolving conflicts without the need for coercive authority. By relying on governments and other institutions for protection, individuals surrender their autonomy and become dependent on systems that ultimately prioritize control over freedom. Freedom as the ultimate value. Throughout The End of All Evil, Locke emphasizes that freedom is the highest moral value and the natural state of humanity. He defines freedom as the ability to think, act, and live with certainty. Below is a detailed article about The End of All Evil by